Now, it's time for our second session of the day on What are the Do's and Don'ts in Hiring Top Talent by Jacquelynne. Over to you, Jacquelynne.
Hello, everyone. How are you? Hope you're doing well today. Today, we're going to touch on the fun stuff, HR. So what I want to do is just focus on the do's and don'ts of HR trends. A little disclaimer before we begin. This presentation is for educational purposes only. TriNet provides legal, compliant HR guidance and best practices. TriNet does not provide legal, tax, or accounting advice. So a little intro, my name is Jacquelynne Suguitan. I've been at TriNet for about 6 years. Prior to TriNet, I actually came from the startup life. So I understand the hurdles as well as everything that goes on with a startup. And then before that, I worked at a Fortune 50. So I've done the whole gamut. We'll touch on HR basics for starting your company, trends impacting talent decisions, key takeaways, and I definitely want to have some time for Q&A. So running your business is an amazing thing, but it is really hard. I know a lot of you in the room are founders and you're dealing with this on a day-to-day basis. You know, number one, it is risky. Not only are you trying to build a company, but you also have to be mindful of the employees that you have, as well as staying compliant. You're also competing for top talent. Working at a tech company, you want to have the best engineers and the best sales team to put your company out there. So as a founder, your goal is to have the type of benefits in HR that will keep your employees long-term. Again, getting access to competitive and cost-effective benefits, finding time to grow your business, and the last, and I think the most important thing, especially because we have been dealing with COVID and different things in the world, is just preparing for the unexpected. As a founder, what can I do to prepare myself for the unexpected? So prepare for the unexpected, which I talked about. 83% of the workforce, and this is all new, prefers the hybrid work model. Since COVID, I'm sure a lot of you are working remotely or have employees that are working remotely. That's actually very common right now. I actually work out of a WeWork every time to time. So again, it's just that balance of a hybrid model and working remotely. 54% of US professionals would consider changing their jobs to gain greater flexibility. More on that later. As well as 15 to 20% employees well-being. Total payroll and voluntary turnover cost is due to burnout. We hear burnout a lot. We've been hearing burnout since the beginning of COVID. And last, and I think this is the most important thing, 25%. The great resignation, my company likes to call it the great onboarding, because although companies are losing a lot of people, they're gaining a lot of people. The voluntary quit rate is 25% higher than pre-pandemic levels. So one of the common questions I deal with when I consult and I work with early stage founders is the common question of, what is a 1099 and what is a W-2? If I am an early stage founder and as of right now I have contractors, when do I flip them to W-2? And why is this important? So the question is, why should you understand the difference? It is important to know the difference between 1099 independent contractors and W-2 employees for 3 reasons. There's many, but this is directly from the IRS. The 3 is misclassifying an employee as an independent contractor can result in financial penalties from the IRS, in short. Number 2, employee classifications affect how both you and your workers are taxed. You're required to withhold income taxes and pay taxes on the wages you pay to your W-2 employees. You don't usually have to withhold or pay taxes on the payments you made for 1099 contractors. And then last, employee classification determines how much control you have over a worker's schedule, payment, and other aspects of the job. Independent contractors define when, how, and where they work. Employees work accordingly to your schedule and policies. Again, I've been at TriNet for quite some time. In a lot of cases, when you're dealing with misclassification, most of the times it's the 1099 or the W-2 employee quitting. So let's say you have a 1099 and you're thought they are a 1099. In the employee's eyes, they think they're a W-2. they end up leaving the job and they try to file for unemployment. It's within that bubble is where that misclassification comes. So it's always good to communicate and know that you're classifying your employees accordingly. So the big question is, when do I shift to W-2 and what are the implications? So I'm gonna let that sink for a second because I think that's a very important question to sink on as far as shifting. So 1099 per the IRS. So facts that provide evidence of the degree of control and independence fall into three categories. Behavior. Does your company control or have the right to control what the worker does and how the worker does his or her job? So for example, are you telling your W-2 or 1099 that you have to be in the office within this amount of time every day of the week? So having, an actual agenda for them, that goes hand in hand with behavioral. Financial. Are the business aspects of your workers' job controlled by the payer? These include things like how the worker is paid, whether expenses are reimbursed, who provides tools and supplies, et cetera. I think for me and through my experience at TriNet, when you're dealing with the 1099 and the W-2 is, are you loaning them an office computer, which is a big one, or are they using their own computers? Another one is, are you giving them an office, like a WeWork for them to work out of? Some of these things fall in line with a W-2 versus a 1099. And then 3, the type of relationship. Are they written contracts or employee type benefits? For example, pension pay, insurance, vacation pay, etc. Will the relationship continue, and is the work performed a key aspect of the business? Again, really important, because at the end of the day, if you're providing benefits for that employee or worker, or let's say hypothetically you're reimbursing them on their benefits, is that really a 1099 or is that a W-2? The best way to figure out if you're dealing with a 1099 or a W-2 is to go to the IRS website. On the IRS website, there is actually a checklist that you could utilize. If you are still fuzzy, there is a form. If you look on my bottom right, it's the SS8, which could be filed with the IRS to determine whether or not they're W-2 or 1099. I will say though, if you submit that form, it does take quite some time. Another way to figure it out is if you partner with a company like TriNet, or you talk to a lawyer. Because at the end of the day, it is a heavy fine if you are basically thinking someone is a 1099, well, really they're a W-2. I am hiring my first batch of W-2s. You just got to raise a round of funding. You got millions of dollars in the bank and you're ready to start a team and flip your 1099s to a W-2. What are 3 things I need to establish or have prior to their start date? I'm going to let everyone sink in and think about that, because I'm sure you have done that, or you're in the process of doing that, or you plan on doing that. So again, you're hiring your first batch of W-2s. What are some important things to establish prior to your start date? And you can, by all means, add it to the chat as well. Because again, if you want to put it in the chat, share with the group. W-2 things to consider. Number 1, and it's the most important one, is have an employee handbook. That is really, really, really important. I like to think about it like this. Your employee handbook, those written languages, is what protects your company. I can give you a very good example. I worked with a company prior to starting on to TriNet that didn't really have an employee handbook. It was very relaxed. It was a Word doc and it was very short. Long story short, they ramped up and they hired a lot of employees and they had unlimited PTO. One of the employees never showed up and it was grounds for termination, but because they didn't have an employee handbook to protect them and the written language that is needed in an employee handbook, there was a big lawsuit and they lost a lot of money as a company. So the most important thing is an employee handbook. Where do I get an employee handbook? Well, if you utilize platforms like TriNet or even Gusto has a generic handbook, you could utilize that handbook to protect you. In many cases of those payroll platforms are very, local state, it's very generic. I would also talk to your legal counsel, your lawyer, to just double check that handbook and make sure that it's airtight to protect your company. The second thing is insurances, general liability, workers' comp. Workers' comp is mandatory if you have W-2 employees. So general insurances, again, talking to someone like TriNet or even an insurance broker, they will definitely help you with that. Payroll cycle is a big one. I work with a lot of international founders that are trying to expand business in the US. The most common practice I see with a lot of international founders in all places around the world is they're used to monthly payroll cycle. So an international founder would come to the US and start paying their employees monthly, but in truth, it's actually non-compliant with most states. So just making sure you're compliant. Another example is like the state of Connecticut. They don't allow semi-monthly payroll cycle, which is the most common payroll cycle I see within tech founders. So know your growth plans. If your growth plans are in specific states that are very strict with certain payroll cycles, just make sure you're paying your employees accordingly. PTO, accrual versus unlimited. Do you have unlimited PTO? Do you want that? A lot of tech companies in the Bay Area like to be competitive and they have unlimited PTO, but there's also a lot of companies that don't. My question and what I want you to think when you leave this room is if you have unlimited PTO today, do you have the internal writing to protect you if anyone does try to sue you for wrongful termination? Just make sure you have those jurisdictions and the approval process for your internal payroll. SUTA FUTA FICA, payroll taxes. Again, things to consider. You're going to be paying for payroll taxes. And then overall benefit offerings, equity, healthcare, et cetera. Those are also things to consider when dealing with your W-2 employees. So this is actually a thing now. When COVID happened, prior to COVID, I'm based here in the Bay Area where most tech companies are. You have their tertiary tech markets. And back in the day, everyone would go to the office. You get free lunch in the office, et cetera. When COVID hit, people started moving back, leaving San Francisco because rent is expensive here. So they moved to different states. And so the question today is, how do I pay my employees? And there's 3 ways and 3 buckets. And I want to express that there is no right and wrong way. We have thousands of companies at TriNet, and all of them are different. It's dependent on your company culture. So the first is, the pay structure is based on your HQ and region. So everyone in your employees are paid accordingly by where your company is HQ. The second that I've noticed is residents and remote from work. So their payroll is based where that employee gets paid. So for example, I am an engineer and I am an engineer in San Francisco versus I am an engineer and I am an engineer in Nebraska. Obviously, the pay is a little bit different because of the cost of living. So with that company's payroll structure, they're paying people accordingly by their region. And then the last one is the national average. They're looking at the national average. What is the average payroll for an engineer? And that is what we're going to pay our engineers when we hire. Again, there's no right and wrong answer. It's really, number one, as a founder, how do you want your company culture to look like? What are your growth plans? Are you going to hire people all over the US, or are you focusing on New York and California and specific markets? I will say this, and I heard a very beautiful talk from one of our tenured HR people at TriNet, is let's say hypothetically before COVID, you were with one structure. Let's just say HQ to regional, but everyone moved remotely in different markets and you want to shift it to a different type of payroll. You do need to have that leeway to tell people ahead of time if you make those switch. You also have to make sure you have everything aligned internally, legally, to protect you. The common question they got when they did that presentation is, what is that window I should warn my employees if I'm changing that structure? At least 60 days. Okay. There's a race for talent. So we touched on compliance. We touched on the difference between HR and 1099s. I'm sorry, W-2 and 1099s. Now let's talk about talent. 42-day average time to fill a given position. So there is some time to fill it. Just know that if you are, adding more people to your roster. $15,000 is the cost of turnover per employee. 65% of your workers are looking for a new job, US workers, and 50% hiring managers who cannot find qualified candidates. So, as an employer, you want to recruit that top talent, but you also want to be mindful of the time it takes to find that talent. Benefits is our next subject since we're touching on talent. And so the big question is, how do I provide, or what is the story about benefits? For those that are international, some of you come from different countries where benefit is given by the government and you don't need to deal with different carriers. With TriNet, I am an expert in this field. The number one thing that founders normally give in the beginning is equity, right? Equity, if you're very early, I have a lot of founders that give their employees equity, but there's no benefits yet. Once they get that round of funding or enough runway to provide benefits, that's when they turn on the switch for benefits. And by benefits, I mean healthcare, I mean dental, vision, flexible spending, 401k. I do want to note now there are some mandatory requirements. So for example, for those that do not know, the state of California, starting June of this year, you have to provide 401k if you have 5 employees or more. So again, just knowing and making sure you are compliant. Benefits after payroll is the second most expensive thing in a company. So one of the questions I get from founders is, well, what is competitive? What do I know? How much benefit should I offer? Because that ultimately, that is how you control your company and that's how you attract the top talent. If you're doing benefits for the first time, my biggest advice for you, and let's say you're offering medical, is you start where you financially are comfortable with, and every year you can add to your benefits. The hardest thing to do is when you start benefits for the first time, you're funding a lot. You're like, well, I'm going to offer 100% everything. I'm going to give them this and that and that. And then the next year, all of a sudden, you're running low on runway, and then you have to pull back on the benefits. It's better to add more every year than to take away. So that's the best advice I can give. And during our Q&A, if you have questions on what's competitive benefits, I can definitely touch on that as well. Federal law regulations govern workplace less than 180. It's too early for me. $160,000 average total defense and settlement cost per discrimination case. 85,000 discrimination charges filed every year. So I talked about protecting your company. When it comes to mitigating risk with people, and by people, your employees, how should I protect myself as a founder? So let that sink in. If you want to add to the chat, by all means do. But how do I protect myself as a founder? So I talked about it earlier, so I'm not going to touch on it very long, but having that employee handbook, making sure it's updated is really important. If, for example, you hire an employee in a brand new state, you have to make sure you update employee handbook to speak the language of the new state that you're hiring with. State mandate training, such as sexual harassment and discrimination. In specific states, California, for example, you do have to do sexual harassment training if you have over 5 employees. So making sure you have those trainings so that you don't get fined. Pay transparency and offer letters. Very, very important. The offer letter is really important, again, to protect your company. Pay transparency is very important. I attended an HR talk recently and they talked about pay transparency. It's important because of retention and it also sets expectations. Let's say you are hiring your first person, right? By pay transparency, it's more so, here's your base. Here are your quotas and your goals. Here is the pay that I'm going to provide for you if you hit those metrics. And it's important to put that in writing to protect yourself. And also your employee knows ahead of time, these are the goals and metrics that I need to make in order for me to get paid this. If I do not make these metrics, just know I will not get paid this amount. So again, it's just having that proper expectation on both ends. And then claims and coverage. Workers' comp, I mentioned, is important. General liability is important. And then EPLI. So I'm going to repeat that again. EPLI has been very big since I started. What EPLI does, and it's not that expensive, it's a very affordable insurance. It protects you from wrongful termination, discrimination, as well as time. So at the end of the day, you are protected. Anything that involves people, that's what it is. I'm sorry, not time, sexual harassment. So sexual harassment, discrimination, and wrongful termination. that is protected through EPLI. When benchmarking, which I'm sure you guys are, if you're raising, when benchmarking your growth plans, what should you consider? Besides payroll, what are other hard costs factoring people? So if any of you founders here listening are raising around right now, are working on your pitch decks and everything to present to VCs, what should you consider when you're factoring people? I mentioned this earlier, SUTA, FUTA, FICA. So SUTA is state unemployment taxes. FUTA is federal unemployment taxes. So making sure that you have your taxes on that operational benchmarking report. Workers' compensation. So making sure you have the workers' comp and the fees involved. Benefit packages, which I talked about earlier. Very, very early stage companies, a lot of them provide, for example, medical, and then like dental and vision is an optional. They don't contribute, but they open it up for their employees to elect. LTD-SC, which is long-term disability, short-term disability. I don't normally see that in very early stage companies when they contribute. I see that more in like Series A, a little bit later actually. Depends on your head count. It also depends where you're at because certain states provide short-term disability. And then 401k, again, if you're in those states where you have to have 401k because you have 5 employees, you do have to provide that. If not, a lot of early stage companies don't provide 401k until later on. Trainings are expensive and they are time consuming. So making sure that you have the financials that are involved with any kind of training that you have in your company. Office supplies, laptops, for example, is a big expense, or reimbursement. So for example, some companies, because they work remotely, a lot of founders are actually reimbursing their internet or their phone bill. So are you doing that in your company? Is that the culture you want to provide as far as reimbursing, let's say $50 worth of internet a month? Culture, back in the day, we have the free lunches, annual outings, welcome swag. What I'm seeing with COVID is a lot of the allocation that the companies would have for free lunches is now gone because everyone's remote, and they would utilize that budget for something else. So I once consulted, this was about last year, a company that used to give free lunches to the office because everyone was inside every day. Because they no longer do that, that's a lot of money that's extra sitting down there. So what they did is they actually increased their benefit offering and was able to provide a bigger benefit package because they took out the free lunches. And then growth plans. That's really important. Are you planning on growing multi-state? Are you planning on growing internationally? Because if you are growing internationally, there are other legal fees involved as well as other systems in place you have to set up internally in order to be compliant internationally. Same with visas, right? If you have employees that are visas, visa renewals and the fees behind visas, and then government lawyer fees. So key takeaways. I put this is actually, so what TriNet is, we are a PEO, we're a professional employment organization. At the end of the day, what we do is founders focus on what they need to do and we do the HR tasks to make sure you're compliant. But even outside of TriNet and what we do, I say that these are the ground pillars of what makes a company and what protects a company. Having the payroll, making sure that you're doing your payroll and you're accounting for your payroll. Having the benefit offerings, really big, COBRA. If you are having a W-2 employee and you terminate people, making sure that you're doing COBRA administration for termination, for example. Risk and mitigation, I touched on that. So the list of what's important. Technology platform, a lot of payroll providers provide that. You have the Gustos, you have the Ripplings, you have the TriNets. All of us have that technology platform to make sure you have the reporting you need in order to present it to your, to your board. And then HR expertise. One of the beautiful things that we excel at TriNet is you actually have a designated HR team to protect you and that you can work with and collaborate with your HR. So what I normally see with early stage founders is founders are basically doing the HR. You're wearing the hats. You're building your company, you're raising, you're doing HR. So normally what I see is they either work with a PEO like a TriNet to offset the HR, or they hire like an HR generalist, someone that is very early stage or newish to HR, maybe someone that graduated from college, but they're using platforms to mitigate the risk for them and just having the HR generalist do the admin work. So those are the most common that I see for, companies that are like seed, pre-seed around that. Even at some cases, Series A. R&D tax credit is really important. With TriNet, we actually work closely with CPAs to provide that. What that is money in your pocket. If you are a founder right now, you have W-2 employees, and let's say right now you're not profitable and you're still building your product and you're still in the research and development phase, just know that you have access to R&D tax credit. And I would work with a temp CFO firm. I would work with a firm like TriNet or similar partners that do what we do to make sure that at the end of the year or during tax season, you get that R&D tax credit. Because again, that's extra money that you can get to help with your company's runway. And again, I work at TriNet. Feel free to add me. I mentioned what we do at TriNet. Ultimately, what we want to do is just to protect your company so that you grow and scale with you and provide the benefits needed. I added my LinkedIn, so feel free to add me. We do a lot of events as well. So if you're local or if you're in different tech markets, my colleagues always do HR events and we're happy to invite you. With that being said, I definitely want to open the floor if anyone has any questions that I can answer.
Thank you, Jacquelynne. That was a great session. Please give our audience members a couple of seconds to send in their questions. All right. So the first question is, do you have a favorite payroll platform for startups to leverage?
I mean, we use, we're TriNet, so we do payroll. Payroll is the genesis of our platform. So not only do we do payroll, we do benefits, we do HR, we do all of the above. So we work with a lot of startups as well. And it also depends if you're very, very early and let's say you don't want to offer benefits yet, right? Let's just say I want to be lean and I just want to do payroll without benefits, because most of the time clients come to me when they're ready to offer benefits. The commons one I see is Gusto. I see Zenefits. We actually acquired Zenefits, so that's another one. There are also others like Paylocity in tech. I rarely see that, to be very frank. The two that I see are the ones I named, as well as TriNet. And ADP, that's another one. ADP, it's a little archaic, but I do see that in the market. If you're dealing with international founders and you're dealing with payroll, that is a different ballgame. We have a lot of partners that we work with. So depending on your growth plans internationally, there's different type of payroll providers that can to accommodate.
All right. What are you seeing right now as far as technology companies' benefit offerings?
Yes, this is a good one. And I'm going to be very mindful because everyone in the room knows that, the talks of recession, the talks of inflation. And, I recently had lunch with one of my VC partners. This was last Tuesday. And I asked her, I was like, so what are you telling your portfolio companies today? Like, what's the status? What's the message I'm hearing? And what she said to me, she said, 18-month runway. Because as of right now, we're going to hit a recession and it's going to be harder to get, fundings for these companies. And because of that, founders are very mindful with their benefit offerings, especially because we are during that benefit renewal season. So there's no right and wrong answer. It really depends on your budget. But what I do see for an early stage company is offering medical for their employees. So for example, maybe like 100% medical for employee only at like a high deductible plan. Normally high deductible plans are much cheaper than a PPO. And if employee wants to elect a richer plan, they can. I also see dental and vision, depending on your funding. In some cases, it's offered to their employees, but the founder does not contribute. So the employees can get dental and vision, but you as a founder are not going to pay for it. But at least offering that goes a long way. So those are the big common ones. The shift right now, like I said, is high deductible healthcare plans. It's a win-win. As a founder, it's one of the cheaper plans. You're not paying a lot of money for it. But then also employees are happy because they have an HSA. I want to chat. So HSA. So HSA is a health savings account. What that is at the end of the day, employees can contribute to a health savings account, and that stays with them for life. So if I work, let's say at Kiwi Tech, and you're providing an HSA for me, and I'm putting money in it, and I leave Kiwi Tech, that money will stay with me no matter where I go. I could use that savings. Let's say 10 years from now, I need to get surgery to pay for my surgery. If I do not touch it by the time I'm 65, that turns into retirement money. So again, contributing to something like a high deductible health plan offers an HSA to your employees, low cost for you as a founder. Employees are happy because they have a health savings account. It is a win-win. And in many cases, you don't need to contribute to your HSA, but at least you can offer it.
All right. How has overall offerings changed since COVID, especially when with companies hiring more remote versus in person?
Yes. I mentioned this earlier, taking away those office lunches. It's quite interesting too, because think about it as a founder, you're getting a dedicated office space. That is a lot of money. Now that you're dealing with remote workforce, you don't need to spend as much money as you did before. I have seen this though, if you're in big tech markets, seeing your employees face to face is still great. It still builds morale. So what I have seen, and our company does it, as well as a lot of the companies I bring on board, is they would get like a WeWork space or a co-working space, but they would get like a small office and have it so that employees are remote, but maybe like once or twice a week, they would meet up in person if they're comfortable to build that morale. So I see that. So that's there. And then you could offer free lunch when they're there. Another thing is benefits. There's a big shift in benefits now because people are trying to be lean, and also like the social economic market or the social political market. What I mean by this is like Roe v. Wade. Politics aside, a lot of tech companies are like, I have remote workforce, and for them, getting healthcare for women is very important. How do I make sure as a founder, I'm providing these benefits to my employees that are in markets that they cannot get it? Because as a founder, it's unfair that my employee in one state can get certain things and my employee in another state does not have the same benefits. So that's another thing that a lot of founders are talking about is company culture. You want to build a company culture where people feel safe. So that again is another conversation is when you're looking at benefits, are my benefits equal for my employees? Am I being fair? Especially if I'm dealing with multi-state.
All right. What are your predictions when it comes to people and hiring within the next year, especially with the potential recession and the social political climate?
I did the social political, but hiring. I think hiring now is going to be a lot more strategic. I didn't touch on this earlier and I should have, and I apologize, but where do I get compensation benchmarking? Like if you're a founder, you have to be very mindful of how much am I paying my employees? Am I overpaying my employees? Am I competitive? And what are the cases to it? So I'm actually going to go back to one of the slides. I apologize. Because I want to touch on that because that's a good answer to that question is, once I find it, payroll. So a lot of cases, founders would try to find payroll on places like LinkedIn, for example, or they would go to free websites. I will say this, use that with caution. If you're using a site like LinkedIn, for example, to get the average of what to pay your employee or a free site, just keep in mind a lot of those sites use that through their employees. And just like me, I'm a Yelper. Normally when I write a Yelp review, it's because I'm very happy or I really hate the service. So then you never have like that middle employee that actually is decent with the company, but they didn't have that time or energy to write reviews. It's always good to look at those sites that are paid for because those sites are the ones that get it directly from the employer, not the employee. The second thing to keep in mind is if you're getting a salary compensation report from a free site, they never talk about the benefits and everything else wrapped in it, just the payroll. And I mentioned this earlier, right? Like you're dealing with training, you're dealing with medical and benefits. So factor that in when you actually hire your first employee and be mindful. I'm always happy. Any other questions, or is there anything you want me to highlight that I didn't touch on that maybe I might know in like the HR people space?
I don't think we have any other questions left as of now. So I guess if we get any questions, I'll surely mail them to you.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, everyone. Add me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to answer any questions if it's personal and it's regarding your HR. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jacquelynne. Thank you for the wonderful session and for some amazing answers.